Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first event in our new series, In Conversation With. We are launching this new series by inviting our own UNSW Chancellor David Gonski to host a conversation with a very special guest, Secretary Janet Yellen, former Secretary of the US Treasury, and without any doubt, one of the most important economic policymakers of the last half century. On Wednesday, Secretary Yellen will be receiving an honorary doctorate from the University of New South Wales, and that will happen on Wednesday on our campus, of course, in Kensington. Welcome, Secretary Yellen. I am incredibly excited having such an esteemed guest with us tonight. But I must also admit that I have absolutely no idea how we are ever going to follow this up with a second act. Perhaps we will simply stop the series after this first conversation, and we will call it the most successful UNSW series ever. Dear guests, I am Frederick Ansehill. I am the Dean of UNSW Business School and your host this evening, and it is a pleasure to welcome all of you tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of the lands where we are meeting tonight, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past and present. Now, if you wonder why you are here tonight, well, we invited you because we value your friendship, and we believe that you share our values and ambitions. At UNSW Business School, we are convinced that good economic policy is the key to future prosperity. And we're also convinced that good economic policy is rooted in rigorous economic thinking, research, and education. That is what our business school stands for, and we know you are our best ambassadors in promoting that idea. But now, if you wonder why you are here tonight, here as in this beautiful art gallery of New South Wales, there's also a reason for that. It is because we believe that there is not only beauty, but also truth and knowledge to be found in art. And last week, when I was preparing for this amazing event, I wandered off on the ground floor of the original building, the Nala Noora, and suddenly I found myself standing for a large painting. It's called Vive l'Empereur, depicting the Napoleonic Wars. And it's a truly massive painting. It dominates the entire room. I invite you to go and have a look. It's really impressive. And standing before that in awe, I could not help but being reminded of how the Napoleonic Wars were rooted in Napoleon's ideas about economic protectionism and territorial expansion. And it warns us that sometimes trade wars can and do escalate into real wars. And as I wandered off in the next room, and David, you know how much I love the museum, I came in another room where I saw banned paintings that in 1930s Germany featured in an exhibition of degenerate art. The degenerate art exhibition was designed by the regime in Germany at the time to make clear to artists and to the general public which topics were no longer appropriate to be produced and displayed in art. And I could not help thinking about what this means for Australian researchers who last week received a survey from their US funders with a list of topics that are no longer appropriate to conduct research on. But my dear friends, I can assure you that at UNSW Business School, we will continue conducting research on the economic benefits of global trade, on the economic risks of climate change, and on the importance of gender equity in our economies. Again, because we believe good economic policy is the key to prosperity, both economic and social prosperity. And it is in that context today that we are so proud to have Secretary Yellen with us, because during her various tenures, she has been a role model, a leading light for all of us in our pursuit of advancing prosperity through developing better economic policy. Dear friends and colleagues, I am sure you are as excited as I am to hear from Secretary Yellen directly. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded and the video will be available on the UNSW Business School website in the coming days. It is now my pleasure to welcome UNSW Chancellor, Mr. David Gonski, AC, who will host the conversation. Please join me in welcoming the Chancellor on stage.
Thank you, Frederick. I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this wonderful building stands, and I pay all of our respects to their elders, past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm much more optimistic about Conversation With, and I just wanted to tell you that only you can put on your CV that you were on the first night of Conversation With, and we are going to expect even past prime ministers or whatever to put it on their CV, and we'll be checking shortly. If you think I look worried, it's true. I am worried because I'm about to interrogate one of the best known people in the business world at this time. And I'm going to interrogate her in front of all of the people that are necessary and important to me in my little world. Not exactly the most brilliant thing to do, but I'm going to try it. But what I want to do before I start, because just in case you get nothing out of my interview, and I'm hoping the Secretary will answer my questions, I thought I'd tell you a bit about her. So even if the interview is bad, I'm sure the interviewee will be brilliant, at least you'll get something from it. Secretary Yellen was born in Brooklyn, New York. Her journey to becoming one of the world's most respected economists began with her pursuit of academic excellence. She earned a bachelor's degree in economics from Brown University in 1967, and she later received a PhD in economics from Yale University in 1971. Her academic career saw her teaching at prestigious institutions such as Harvard, the London School of Economics, and the University of California, Berkeley. She has distinguished herself as an insightful and rigorous scholar in the fields of macroeconomics and labour markets. Dr. Yellen's public service is marked by her historic leadership at the highest levels of global economic governance. In 2014, she became the first woman to serve as chair of the Federal Reserve. That's the central banking system of the United States. Her tenure was from 2014 to 2018 and was characterized by a careful balancing of monetary policy, guiding the US economy through a period of recovery following the 2008 GFC, and her focus on reducing unemployment while maintaining stable inflation rates, underscored by her commitment to inclusive economic growth and a recognition of the human impact of microeconomic policy decisions. In 2021, if that wasn't enough, Dr. Yellen once again made history as she took to the role as the 78th US Secretary of Treasury under President Joe Biden. She became the first woman ever to hold this position, and as far as I know, the first woman ever to hold both positions, and I actually think the first person to hold the three positions that she's held. Quite something. As Treasury Secretary, she played a pivotal role in addressing the economic fallout of COVID-19 pandemic, advocating for substantial fiscal stimulus packages to ensure economic stability, reducing inequality, and protecting the most vulnerable in society. Her leadership during this unprecedented time demonstrated not only her profound economic expertise, but also her commitment to the principles of fairness and social responsibility. Beyond her specific roles in the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, Dr. Yellen has been a leading advocate for increased labour force participation, particularly amongst women and minorities, as well as for policies aimed at reducing economic inequality. Her voice has consistently championed the importance of sustainable economic and equitable growth. Her achievements have been widely recognised. In addition to her leadership roles, she'd received an enormous number of honorary doctorates and so on, which I could list, but we'd be here all day. But I do want to endorse what the Dean says. She's getting the honorary doctorate on Wednesday, all being well. We'll mark the interview and see how we go. She's been named among the most powerful women in the world by Forbes. Her influence reaches beyond economic policy and into broader societal debates. I am, as I say, with great trepidation, looking forward to this interview, and I'd like to invite Secretary Yellen to come and join us. Well, thank you for taking this on, and thank you for agreeing to a non-professional interviewer to do it. We'll see at the end whether you agree with that decision.
Well, thank you for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to join you, and nothing to fear in the conversation.
Are you sure? Sorry.
I am.
Look, I wanted to start with a question. Always, I'm told, when you want to interview somebody, find something you've got in common. And we have something in common. We are both the children of medical doctors. So my first question, Secretary, is to ask you, how did you escape becoming a medical doctor and why did you choose economics?
Well, my father's office was in our house, and I saw what it was like to be a medical doctor, but I must say that I was never tempted at all in that direction. But my parents, and particularly my father, did have an influence on my choice of professions. And that was because my parents lived through, they came of age, got married, and my father started a practice during the Great Depression. And the Depression had a major influence on how they thought about the world and their experiences. And my father's patients were largely blue-collar workers who suffered unemployment frequently just due to the ups and downs of the economy. And over dinner, my father would often discuss the problems that his patients faced when they were afflicted by unemployment. And he would emphasize that it wasn't only the loss of income, it was a loss of self-esteem, it was often health issues, family tensions and struggles, that a job is central to one's identity and ability to care for one's family. And so that was something that I grew up with. Now, when I went off to college, I never expected that to become part of my life. I was interested in math and science. I thought I would major either in math or in chemistry, but I did take an economics class my very first semester. And that's where I learned about Keynesian economics. And suddenly I had what I look back on as an aha moment, because I came to understand what it was about the functioning of the economy that could give rise to something like the Great Depression, or more generally, the ups and downs of the business cycle. What kind of market failure existed that could drive episodes like that, where all too many people would simply find there were not enough jobs for them to be able to care for their families. And economics, it appealed. It was a logical and analytic way of thinking about how the economy works. But unlike math, it was really about something fundamental to human welfare. And so when I saw that, I was hooked. And I've really spent the rest of my career, as you mentioned in your introduction, thinking about working people, jobs, and unemployment and how to combat them. And I saw that there were policies that could be used to address this and to mitigate the ups and downs in the economy. And that's how I became interested in it.
Well, I can't speak for your father because I never met him. Probably he would forgive you, but I'm not sure. I know everybody is willing me to ask the obvious question, and I'll get to those about tariffs and so on. But I want to ask a few others before we get there. When you started to get into economics, you chose a life partner who is here tonight, and we welcome him, who, by the way, is a Nobel laureate. And for those of you who go to the University of New South Wales, he'll be the first person who can park in our spot that says Nobel laureates only. But the question I want to ask you is, how do two brilliant economists work together when they are life partners? And you've written so much together, and of course separately as well, but how does it work?
Well, it works almost seamlessly because we share deep and common intellectual interests, and that's partly what was the basis of our friendship and attraction when we first met, is that we viewed the world very similarly and had very similar interests. And one of the most difficult things for families where both partners work is managing work and family life in a way that's balanced. And when two people work together and do research together, as we did, things naturally come together because you have common priorities. If we're working on a project together, you have your role and I have mine. It's important to me that you are able to have enough time to do your work and carry your part of the load, and vice versa. And in our relationship, each of us was careful to make sure that we created space for the other to contribute to the joint work that we were doing together. And let me just say, I'm immensely fortunate to have a husband and partner who's always cared about me and my career and my ability to advance, and has always been willing to make sacrifices, whether it was moving to Washington and becoming a commuter back to the University of California at Berkeley so that I could hold jobs at the Fed, that he was willing to prioritize that. In terms of childcare, it may not surprise you to know that our son became an economist. People often ask me what it's like around our dinner table, and I have to sometimes say that it may be a little bit too rich an economics discussion to be tasteful to many people, but it works for us, and I think we've been mutually supportive of one another.
Well, we're looking for the paper for the three of you so that next time I can ask, how did that work? Can I just, the obvious question when one talks, particularly as I was today to some young female students at the university, you've been the first woman to do this, the first woman to do that. Was it difficult to get to these high positions as a woman? And, is there some solution that you had to work on to actually get through some of those gates?
So let me first say, it is an immense honor and privilege to be entrusted with the positions that I've held. And they're immensely interesting positions and tremendously satisfying to have the chance to hold these positions and deal with the issues involved. So I certainly feel I've been given massive opportunities, and I have never felt as a woman in a profession that has become less dominated by men, but still women are underrepresented. I've never felt that I suffered overt discrimination. And I've been fortunate to have mentors, which is something that many women lack in fields like economics and business, who have showed me the ropes and helped me get ahead. That said, I would say that women face barriers. And the older I've gotten, the more I recognize the significance of those barriers. So I would say, let me give you an example. My first job was as an assistant professor at Harvard, and I was given lots of time to do research. That wasn't an issue. But my research didn't meet the cut. I didn't get tenure at Harvard. That was something that was expected. I didn't expect to get tenure, but my publishing fell short. And when I look back, at the time, if someone had asked me why was that, I'd say, well, look, I had a perfect opportunity. I had all the time and resources that I needed, and I didn't measure up. And that's fair, and I still feel that. But I also feel, for most of the time that I was at Harvard, I was the only woman in the department. And economics is a field where co-authorship is actually very common and very important. And many of the men who were assistant professors, they worked together, they wrote papers together. And how did that happen? Well, it happened in part because people hang out together, they'd go out for dinner, they'd have lunch together, they'd go off for a drink after work, they'd develop friendships. While socializing, they'd often talk about their work, ideas would be generated. That kind of networking in a field like economics is very important for developing the relationships that give rise to co-authoring and joint publishing. And I realized that I wasn't fully integrated into that. And one of the ways I came to realize it is after I had been there for about 4 years, a second woman was hired. And she and I quickly became very close friends. And then we started writing papers together, and we wrote 7 or 8 papers together. 30 years later, I asked her, as I began to think more deeply about the barriers that women face in rising in the profession, I said, Rachel, do you think we ended up writing those papers together because we had strong overlap of interests or because we happened to be the only 2 women in the department? And it surprised me. She said, well, it's just because we had very strong interests in common. And I thought, that's ridiculous. Well, it was true. It was true that we had overlapping interests, of course. But the fact that we became friends, we hung out together, we went to lunch, we did things together. Yeah, we began to talk about things that we were interested in. We developed projects. We worked together. It was natural. And that's what the guys were doing. And so in fields where women are underrepresented, this networking issue and inclusion, I do think is a barrier. Now, I guess it was 2 years ago that a woman by the name of Claudia Golden won the Nobel Prize. And she won the Nobel Prize for her work on women in the labor force. And she did a great deal of research to look at particularly issues like why are women so underrepresented in economics and in business. And what she found is that the difficulty of combining a career and family, work-life balance, really impedes the success of a lot of women. And particularly in professions where you're expected to be on call 24/7. No time is untouchable. If there's a business deal on a weekend, you're expected to drop everything and do it. And in professions like that, women who still, even in marriages where there's a sharing of the workload and childcare, still a disproportionate amount falls on women, and that's very difficult to manage. So I guess what I see over time, when I first started going to international meetings like the G20, and I would look around the table, there were very few women. There were not a lot of people who were at the top, women who were at the top levels, more in the back benches. And over time, that's improved. And I think that's really a good thing, is that numbers are increasing. But still, I think the women feel an affinity for one another. The very first person that Rachel Reeves called when she was named UK Chancellor of the Exchequer was me. And, I feel a special bond with her. We're both firsts as finance ministers. And I notice when I'm in international meetings that the women we always end up taking a picture together. We always end up spending some quality time with one another. That's important. But I feel immensely privileged and very fortunate to have, been given the opportunities that I've had.
I think it's more than just the opportunities. I think you obviously had the ability to handle it. Can I take you to another question that's actually been asked of me to ask you? When you look at your career, you've had many times when you are top, but you've also had some gaps between them. How did you cope with that? And is it quite a hard thing? If 1 minute you are basically, maybe it's Secret Service, maybe it isn't around you, people know who you are. Next minute you're back at the university or even at a think tank. And then, of course, you're back at the top again. How does one cope with that?
Well, the personal part of it about being at the top and then less recognized, for me, I feel comfortable in both worlds. And that personal part of it, giving up the Secret Service, I consider, frankly, a plus rather than a minus. I have a lot more personal freedom being out of the job. That part hasn't been hard for me. And I've always found useful things to do when I've not been holding a public office. But I do find that holding these public policy roles and being involved in policy has changed my interests in my orientation. So when I went back to academia, I spent 5 years in Washington at the Federal Reserve, and then as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. I returned to Berkeley after that and went back on the faculty. I found that my ability to do the kind of research that gets published in top economics journals had really diminished, and my interest in doing that kind of work had diminished. And that was an adjustment, because that's a critical contribution that one looks to professors to make. My interests had become more practical and more policy-oriented. And I certainly found ways to continue writing and weighing in on policy, but I found that the kind of work that I was doing changed. At the same time, my ability to contribute to the university through administrative roles, through guiding students, through university service, I was called on to do that more than I had in the past, and I felt that that was very satisfying as well. When I left being chair of the Federal Reserve, I went to the Brookings Institution, a place I very much enjoy, and many colleagues of mine in the Biden administration are now joining Brookings as well. And that's a group of scholars with an interest in public policy who are trying to influence debate and weigh in thoughtfully in ways that shape public policy. So I found it not that difficult, all in all.
And this is a question that the Dean would ask me to ask you. Academics generally in Australia stick to academic life. And indeed, when I was reading on the weekend about you, some people were quite nasty when you got these top jobs and said, she's an academic. What does she know about politics? In America, people move from sector to sector much more seamlessly than they do here. We've even got people, I'll come back to them, from business going to presidency and that sort of thing. That was a joke, sorry. But here, we're much more rigid. Do you think it's a good thing to move? Do you think it is wrong that, for example, academics enjoy sitting and doing what they do? Should we be pushing our academics into other things? And indeed, people in other sectors moving into academia, business moving into politics, etc., etc.
Well, I think the kind of fertilization that comes, cross-fertilization from academics in government, business people in government, and going back into academia and business is extremely worthwhile. And from the government standpoint, I think it ends up improving policy. Certainly in economics, many academics do work that is highly policy relevant and value the chance to put their ideas into action, to see how policy is made, and to better understand how to make a contribution. I mean, in the United States, we have a Council of Economic Advisors that traditionally has been mainly academics who spend a couple of years in government. I think almost to a person, people find this is an extremely valuable experience. They get to contribute their ideas at a high level to understand the realities of policymaking, that there are complexities that they may not have taken into account in thinking about how to craft policy in a university that need to be addressed in the actual world of policy. And they learn about political constraints and, sometimes they learn to look for policies that are good but not perfect, and participating and sometimes making sure that the very worst ideas don't become policy, which often are at least surfaced in policy debates, is making a contribution as well. And the experience of participating in policy when one goes back into academia, I think, is valuable in guiding research in good directions. Certainly at Treasury, we have very much valued having people who've had direct financial experience in Wall Street or in the business community. And so I think there's been enrichment there as well. And it's very common in the United States to have academics participate in policy. And, often academics bring good ideas that people who've been in an organization for a long time wouldn't think of. So you mentioned the criticism that, how can academics make a contribution? And there I'd say, academics often have a framework for thinking about the world, which helps from an analytic standpoint. They can understand how to frame an issue and address a policy that's relevant to it. And I can give you an example of ways in which I think academics did make contributions. One of the issues that I was involved with Treasury had to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration was fully committed to supporting Ukraine as best we could, and we had indicated very clearly, even before Russia invaded Ukraine, that there would be the most serious consequences for Russia if it proceeded to do so. And Treasury is the agency in the US government, the main agency that crafts sanctions and puts them into place. And so we were tasked with creating a set of sanctions that would bring, frankly, as much pain as possible to Russia to try to get them to withdraw and to end the war against Ukraine. But one of the problems with crafting sanctions, we understood that for Russia, oil was a key source of revenue. Global oil sales were critical. And so Russia could experience a lot of pain if we could figure out a way to lower oil revenues. But if we had taken steps to keep Russia's oil off the global market, that would have had consequences for the entire globe, because it would have driven up global oil prices. It would have hurt the United States. It would have hurt all of our allies, and it would have hurt countries, emerging markets that are, buying oil in global markets. So the tricky business was, how do you craft a policy that can succeed in cutting revenues without taking Russian oil off the market? And our sanctions folks were they had sanctions programs on North Korea and Iran and other places, and they knew a lot about how to craft those sanctions. But this was a problem they had never faced. And so the economists, largely academic economists at Treasury, came up with the idea of trying to cap the price of oil, and doing that by saying, okay, Russia, you can sell oil, but you can sell oil in the global markets, that's fine. And to do so, you need financial services that the West is dominant in supplying to you, like insurance and trade finance. But we're going to cut you off from all of those services if you try to sell your oil above a price that we named, and we ended up making that $60 a barrel. And certainly, now, sanctions always, once they're in place, countries look for ways to get around them. But at least for the first year, we designed a set of sanctions we put in place with our allies that worked in that fashion. We capped the price of oil and left Russia with the incentive to sell it, but cut their oil revenues by close to 40%. So, economists who come with a framework for how to think about things can make a contribution and bring in new ideas, and I think that's enriching.
You've sold me, absolutely. I can feel sort of the will in this room that I've got to move, talking about sanctions, onto things called tariffs. And I would be interested, I think we all would, as we are quite worried about tariffs, and particularly US tariffs. What do you think about where we're going on tariffs? And I'm particularly interested, because we talked about it a little earlier today, what have tariffs got to do with GST and VATs and various other things that are trying to be penalized?
Well, let me say that there are some circumstances where I think tariffs can be appropriate when there are sectors that are of strategic importance to a country, as, for example, semiconductors. The United States decided semiconductors are critically important to our economic future, and we think that there are unfair subsidies in a country like China. Occasionally putting on tariffs to combat unfair trade practices, I think, is appropriate. But what we're seeing now from the Trump administration is at least threats of broad-based tariffs on a huge variety of goods against not only countries that are engaging in unfair trade practices, but against all our friends and closest neighbors. And I think this is an extremely unwise and damaging program. It's damaging to the United States, and it's also damaging to our neighbors in the global economy. And the Trump administration has indicated that on April 2nd, I believe that Australia is only at this point affected by the global tariffs on aluminum and steel. But on April 2nd, President Trump has threatened to announce a broad-based set of so-called reciprocal tariffs in which his administration will decide what the tariff levels and non-tariff barriers are in each country, and then impose tariffs on that country that are similar. And as you mentioned, one of the things that he's indicated he thinks is an unfair trade practice that discriminates against U.S. Producers is value-added taxes. And I will say, I think this is completely and totally misguided. Many countries have value-added taxes. Europe relies on them heavily. Other countries have them, and they are not discriminatory. When there are tariffs that are put on countries like the United States, producers selling into markets where domestic firms in those markets have a VAT, there is a completely level playing field. It is not creating a competitive disadvantage. And to think that this is like a subsidy or an unfair trade practice, I regard as completely wrong. And I believe the WTO was weighed in on this as well and said, this is not an unfair trade practice. So let me make that clear on that. From the U.S. point of view, I think these tariffs are going to be extremely damaging in a number of ways. For consumers who have made very clear that they're unhappy about inflation and the cost of living, a tariff is a tax. It's a tax that boosts the cost of imports. Some of those imports are for consumer goods, and virtually all the research that's been done suggests that where the tariff is born is by the consumers. It's not the case that the country that produces and sells the goods into the United States is just going to absorb the cost of the tariffs. It is American consumers who will pay higher prices. And for many of the consumer goods that we import into the United States, including from China, the consumers who particularly are going to be harmed are low-income consumers. This is like imposing a regressive tax that hurts low-income consumers the most. 40% of U.S. imports are of intermediate goods. And so imposing tariffs on intermediate goods just raises the cost of production for domestic firms. And the aluminum and steel tariffs will have that effect, are already having that effect, boosting, for example, the cost of automobiles that rely on imported aluminum and steel. These tariffs also, by raising import costs, also harm successful U.S. exporters. A company like Boeing, which is the United States' biggest single exporter, relies very heavily on imported intermediate imports and that are being tariffed. And so this harms Boeing's prospects for selling globally, making it less competitive. And what's immensely damaging in many different ways are the tariffs that we're imposing on longtime free trade partners in Canada and Mexico. Within North America, we've had a promise for decades and most recently renegotiated by Trump during his first term that we have a free trade area and we have a fully integrated supply chains across that area. The auto industry, for example, produces many parts in Mexico, many parts in Canada. Assembly of roughly 40% of American automobiles takes place in Mexico and Canada. And a typical car can be shipped back and forth across the border between Canada and the United States 6 or 8 times during the course of production, each time to be hit with a tariff. Now, these tariffs were announced, they've been temporarily withdrawn, and all the investment decisions that were made by businesses going into Mexico, we wanted to move supply chains out of China because we're worried about overdependence on China. A lot of supply chains were shifted, production was shifted into Mexico and Canada, and all of the investment decisions that were made relied on the idea that this is a tariff-free zone and will remain this way for all time. And suddenly these investment decisions will be completely upended. It's estimated that for the United States, the cost of an automobile will rise between $5,000 and $10,000. And of course, you can't have tariffs on Mexico and Canada and then allow cars from Japan and Europe to come in without tariffs, so we'll soon see tariffs on all of those automobiles as well. Well, look, this is very damaging to the United States. So as a policy what is the purpose of the policy? One idea is that it's meant to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, which is very large. But most economists, and what I always taught when I taught international economics, and my guess is that this is true in courses at UNSW as well, is that tariffs don't have little or no effect on a country's trade deficit. What a tariff ends up doing is actually leading to an appreciation of a country's currency. And that occurs, one way to think of it is if you buy less imports, you need less foreign exchange. That drives down the value of foreign currencies relative to your own, or drives up the value of your own currency. And all that happens after the currency appreciates is that you trade less with the rest of the world, exports contract, imports contract, and the trade balance doesn't change. Another way to look at this is to say that a country's trade balance is the difference between its total spending on goods and services and what it produces. And countries like the United States buy more than they're capable of satisfying with their own production, and that gap is reflected as a trade deficit. Another way to think about it is U.S. assets like our Treasury bonds are attractive in financial markets, and what we're selling is Treasury bonds. Unless you do something about the gap between spending and production, you're not going to change the trade deficit. And I strongly doubt that it's going to bring manufacturers back to the United States in significant quantities. And I think the Trump policies have created so much uncertainty for businesses. What's going to happen, and will these tariffs stay in effect long enough? Hopefully, the next president, if they stay in effect for 4 years, will undo them. Would you really want to make a major investment decision to bring manufacturing into the United States in a sector where the U.S. is not competitive just because President Trump has put tariffs in effect next week? And what we're seeing is, if you talk to business people, and we're seeing this in soft data from surveys, is that business uncertainty is extremely high. And in fact, what the Trump tariffs threaten to do is to cause a recession in the United States by curtailing investment. Australia, I think, has benefited, as as many countries have, from a very open trading system. My hope is that Australia will not be badly affected by the Trump tariffs. And as I would say, as you think about how to respond, remembering that tariffs tend to harm countries that put them in place, they tend to be negative, not positive for one's own country, is a good thing to keep in mind. We're seeing a lot of retaliation, which is natural, but it's wise to remember that retaliation can also hurt your own economy.
Thank you. I'd have to say in front of our Dean, I wish I'd had you as my economics lecturer when I did economics 400 years ago at UNSW. You mentioned cars. I understand that an economist could probably save money for the federal government of America. Can a car manufacturer?
I don't think this particular car manufacturer is really mainly trying to save money for the United States. I think there's a motive of breaking things, disrupting the government. There's a retaliation motive that's involved here, and showing elites and activities that the car manufacturer and the president don't like, disrupting their lives. That, I will say, includes universities who have seen their research budgets and grants absolutely axed over the last several months. I mean, if this were about efficiency, is government inefficient? Is it possible to find savings that would reduce the cost of government? I'm sure the answer is yes. Although my experience is that government is bureaucratic, but not markedly inefficient. I don't think it's massively overstaffed, but the level of bureaucracy in government and how it operates is very high, and it is very frustrating to many businesses that want to get something done and find that the procedures and requirements are so onerous that it can take forever. And there are complex reasons why it's become that bureaucratic, but it's not something that you can come in and simply slash by taking an axe to it. What the car manufacturer is trying to do, has done, is come into agencies he knows nothing about and taking an axe to those agencies like USAID that for decades has provided food and assistance with health and health care to the poorest countries around the world and enjoyed bipartisan support in doing that. That's not just a Democratic priority. And to try to convince you that this is not just a matter of carefully looking at where there's fat and waste and cutting it, but something else entirely, I'll give you what to me is the most egregious example of what is going on. Elon Musk has proposed 20% reduction in the staff of the Internal Revenue Service, which is our tax collecting agency. Now, one of the things that I felt best about had happened during the time that I was at Treasury is that we succeeded in getting Congress to legislate an additional $80 billion over the next decade for the Internal Revenue Service. And the reason we wanted it is because the staff over decades of the Internal Revenue Service had been cut to the bone. And the consequences were that the tax gap had escalated to close to $1 trillion a year. What do I mean by the tax gap? So economists calculate, and the IRS does this itself, how much taxes ought to be collected if everyone paid the amount that was due. So that's a hypothetical number because there's some tax fraud. And compare that number, what should be paid in under our existing tax law, with the actual amount of tax revenue that is paid in. That's called the tax gap. And the estimate of the tax gap for the United States over the next decade is $7 trillion. $7 trillion. And how could there be $7 trillion that wasn't being collected? Well, that's because the staff of the IRS had been cut to the bone because there were members of Congress who really did not want to see wealthy individuals, complex partnerships, and corporations having to pay the taxes that were due if they followed the tax law. So the rate of auditing of these sophisticated entities in the United States fell to and is currently close to zero. Well, and when your chances of being audited are close to zero and people have to make a call, should I take a risk or not, that just encourages less tax paying. Okay, and that's where the United States was. So this $80 billion that we got was estimated to result in 7 to 10 times as much tax revenue. It was the best budget deficit reducing expenditure you could possibly make. It had a payoff of 10 to 1. And what Musk did on his first day at the Internal Revenue Service was to say that he would fire most of what was called probationary workers. And probationary workers are those who were there less than 2 years. And those are all of the people who were hired to, these were the auditors, the IT specialists, the tax lawyers who were hired and opening investigations to try to collect that missing $7 trillion. And there is more lost from that than every other penny that will be saved. So this is not really about efficiency in government or reducing the deficit. And I think anybody who's studied the US budget, I mean, I am concerned about deficits in the United States. I think our deficits are too large and need to be reduced. But the reason our deficits are large is because 3 programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, our health and pension programs, are increasing in size relative to the economy as our economy ages. We knew this was going to happen for 30 years. We've had many chances to deal with it. We haven't dealt with it, and we're seeing that play out. And the second factor is that interest rates have risen, and so the cost of servicing government debt has risen. And there doesn't begin to be enough cuts that are possible in the remainder of the spending to make a meaningful difference to the budget deficit.
Thank you for that wonderful answer. You know, I have questions on the COVID pandemic, on the bank you had to close. I've got questions on DEI and whether we should panic that that's all over. I've got at least 59 questions. And the solution I've worked out is the second in conversation with should be with the same person. I want to thank you sincerely. It's been a real privilege. And we have, because of the enormity of having you here, we have 3 past governors of the Reserve Bank in this room. I don't know whether that's ever happened before or whether it happens regularly. Ian Macfarlane, Glenn Stevens, and of course Phil Lowe. And because Phil is the most recent there, I've asked him if he would give the round of thanks, and I call upon him now.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, David. I'd like to thank Chancellor Gonski and Secretary Yellen for a really rich, warm and engaging conversation. On behalf of us all, thank you so much. I first became aware of Janet's work when I was a graduate student in Boston in the late 1980s. At the time, Janet was doing path-breaking research on the labour market, and to this day I still remember reading your papers. Some decades later, I had the privilege of meeting Janet in person. We were governors of our respective central banks at roughly the same time, and we would attend G20 meetings right around the world and countless, perhaps too many meetings in Basel in Switzerland. And over recent years, I've watched, I think as probably everyone else in the room has watched, Janet skillfully operate at the highest level of politics in the United States. The person that I've seen in those various roles as an academic, as a central bank chief, and as a senior government official is really the very same person we've seen in this room tonight. And that's someone who is incredibly committed to making the world a better place, who greatly cares about people, who's compassionate, who believes in international cooperation, who is erudite and thinks deeply about issues, who's rigorous and systematic in her thinking, who is measured and articulate, committed to excellence, and really cares for people, and I would add, is incredibly humble, given all the firsts that she's achieved. That's the Janet Yellen that we've known over many decades, and that's the Janet Yellen we've heard this evening. So Janet, we're deeply grateful that you've come to Sydney to talk to us, and we hope you come back for a second conversation. Your comments reminded us towards the end about the difficult times we're living through. The norms of good policy making are being challenged and policies being upended in an unhelpful way. You said, when you're talking about tariffs in your rather diplomatic language, that tariffs are rather unwise. You then went on to say that they're aggressive, they hurt the people we care most about. They add to uncertainty. They harm US exporters. They disrupt supply chains, and they don't improve the trade balance. Yet despite all that,
they're great.
Tariffs is the most beautiful word. I've heard some would say it's the most ugly word. And the applause that you heard in this room tonight suggests that here in Australia we know all those things you just told us are true. But and this is more positive, your discussion also reminded us that there are people in the United States who are committed to a good global order, and you would be one of the leading ones of those, who accept that common rules of the game are important and that we all gain from trade, and trade barriers make us worse off. So we hope those people in the United States who share your views find their voice and ultimately they prevail. In your discussion, you also reminded us of just how important networks and mentors are in getting the best out of people. And by extension, diverse teams are the best teams. People build off other people. In the language of The Economist, there's a positive externality. By having a diverse team, we all benefit. So we're all stronger through diversity. I think it's another pertinent message and timely message for us. So Janet, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to the second conversation. Could everyone join me in thanking Janet and David?
Thank you so much.
I have the honor of closing this wonderful event, and I hope there will be a second edition. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Thank you, Chancellor, for an inspiring and such a deep conversation. To acknowledge our gratitude, a donation will be made to the UNSW Business School Educational Resource Access Scheme on your behalf. And this scheme supports the inclusion and success of students from equity groups enrolled at UNSW Sydney in the first year undergraduate business programs. As I mentioned, a recording will be made available on the UNSW Business School YouTube channel and the website. And this brings to a close our inaugural conversation with interview. This is, of course, only the first part. I'll invite you to join us for some snacks, maybe a drink. And this is an exceptional opportunity with all the people here in the room to connect with each other, to talk about very uncertain times, but we've learned a lot today, and I'm sure you will have very exciting conversations in the atrium. Thank you all for attending, and let's please reconnect in the atrium. Thank you so much.